Next up, I'm going to go through how I set the deck height clearances for all the pistons and cylinders, just to make sure those new pistons fit exactly right and don't bang into the heads. As you're starting to put together the pistons and put the cylinders on the engine, I found that this is one of the trickier parts. I'd never done this before, but it's putting in the circlips that hold in the wrist pins of the piston. So it's these things. I just slid in the piston, and these little circlips go in and they retain the piston. I found that you need to use a good amount of hand strength, but you can get, sorry, I'm blocking the camera. You can get the clip started and kind of bend it with your thumb. And if I push with my thumb and push with my other hand, I can start it. And then if you take some needle nose pliers and grab part of the clip, you can kind of help bend it in. Oop. You also don't want the piston to drop down in the cylinder when you do this. I'm gonna have to pull it out after. But you can feel it go in and kind of twist it. Didn't get it. And pull the piston up too. I put some assembly lube on that wrist pin. I just think it's probably good to do that. You know, whenever you have metal on metal contact. Let's try this again. I don't know how I'm going to do this once the cylinder is in the engine and I have to kind of contort myself to get this in, but the last one went in a little easier. You don't want to bend them too far either. You don't want to permanently deform them. But there we go. I'm pushing with my thumb. I'm going to bend it over. There's a little notch where you can put the head of the needle nose pliers. Man, it's a little too much. Let's try this again. Well, that was a clenching experience. I pushed the piston out a bit much, and a couple of the rings popped out, and fortunately, thank God, only one side of them popped out, so I could push them back in my fingernail, but the other side was already seated, and I was able to very gently push them back in, and it doesn't look like I hurt anything. But I was able to wrestle the retaining ring for the wrist pin in, and so now I can, it'll butt up against that, and I will not take that out. And so now we can put it in the engine and check the deck clearance. So what I'm going to do now is put the jug onto the engine casing. And what I've had to do is prepare the jug, like I showed before, where I've got the wrist pin in, I've got the copper gasket on, I've now put the retaining ring on the correct side of the piston, unlike the last time. And now this part I found to not be too bad. So I've actually liked to have the engine on its side in order to put this on, so I don't drop the copper gasket off. You have to lift up the conrod. I also want to point out that the rubber bands here make a big difference, because I noticed that when the engine's in this orientation or 180 degrees from this, when you try to turn it over, the conrods can actually hit the case if they can flop around. But if you keep them suspended in the middle of the cylinder hole, they clear fine and you can freely turn the engine. So what you have to do is push a jug on, and you can line up, you can see the wrist pin, and Dempsey talks about pushing in with a hammer. I didn't have to on the last one, or gently tapping it with a rubber mallet. The piston's probably a little cockeyed. It's not exactly turned in the right orientation, so I may have to tap this one in. Let's see, the last one slipped in pretty easily. Oh. Let's turn the piston a little bit. There we go. No, I think I'm going to have to use the tapping technique, which is not a big deal. So, get a long screwdriver, clean it off. And then hopefully you can tap this guy in. There we go. Yeah, the piston has to kind of turn to line up for that to go in okay. But that wasn't too bad. And then I can push the wrist pin all the way in. Make sure the gasket's on okay. And then push the cylinder down. And the piston's pretty far out of the cylinder at this point, so it kind of jams easily. But you can jiggle it. There you go. Try to make sure the gasket stays on or stays aligned. There we go. Cool. So that is seated. We should be still at top dead center. Yep. And now I can turn this and measure the deck height. What the deck height is the distance between the topmost point the piston comes up to and the flat surface, really defined by the top surface of the cylinder or where it meets with the head, where there's a machined surface that rests on the top of the jug. So in Dempsey's book, he talks about taking small pieces of acid core solder, like these, and gluing them on the head. Not gluing them, but using some like silicone sealant. The where is it? The Curetel. Around here somewhere. Yeah, this stuff. Sorry. Cure-LT sealant, this stuff. Which doesn't really dry, it stays kind of wet, but it acts as a nice little adhesive. And so you put those on, you bolt the head on, you torque it down, and what happens is when you turn the crank over, the hollow core of the solder, where you've cleaned the acid out of the middle, gets crushed, and you're left with these little squished pieces of solder. And then you can measure how thick these are and figure out what your deck height is. Now here's the problem with this engine. So Dempsey recommends using this hollow core solder technique for high dome pistons, which I clearly have. But the issue with these CP pistons is that the dome doesn't extend all the way out to the edge of the piston. It actually has a little shelf and then drops down to the side of the piston. And I'm going through all this to hopefully save some of you the trouble that I've gotten into. Not trouble, but the hassle, I guess, that I've gotten into, where this technique doesn't really work because of this little shelf on the piston, the gap that you end up measuring is really just the gap between the dome of the piston and the dome of the head. And for much of it, it's big. It's over a few millimeters, and the smallest it gets is about 1.7 millimeters on these pistons. And why that's an issue is if you took that as the face value as the deck height, it would be too big. So what I realized is that I could measure the deck height just with some vernier calipers, because that little shelf on the piston is wide enough to rest the tail of the caliper on it as I push the caliper down to the deck. And so what I'm measuring now is 1.05 millimeters. And by the way, I've already put my spacers in underneath. So what goes under the jugs is these copper spacers to space the jug off a little bit, and it acts as a gasket. So there's more to this story, actually. If you read Dempsey's book, he recommends that you have a deck height of somewhere between 1.25 and 1.5 millimeters, and I'm measuring just over 1. So I looked around on the Pelican forums and tried to figure out if this is too low. And going back into my machinist notes, he took off about a 1/4 millimeter when he machined the top surface of the jugs, because again, I had to have those machined because the issue with this engine is that the head studs loosened up, the head chattered on the top of the jug, and it marred up the surface, both of the top of the jug and the mating surface on the head. So both of these got remachined, and he took off about a 1/4 millimeter of material in total between the two parts. And so that would lower the deck height by a 1/4 millimeter. But what I've put in here is a shim of 1/2 millimeter, so twice what the normal Porsche spec is. And that's lifted it back up, and I think brought it back up to what it probably was originally, which was about 1 millimeter. Now, the other factor that I had to go back into my email chains with my machinist and also William Knight, who's a Porsche engine builder specialist and from whom I bought my pistons, to understand what the deck height should be for my compression ratio. So that's important because your compression ratio is the measure of how much you're changing the volume of the volume of fuel air mixture from when the piston's at its bottom to its top. So the more you compress the air and fuel, the more work you can get out of the explosion that happens, and the more power you can make. So compression ratio is important, but you don't want to go too high, or you can get premature detonation of the fuel air mixture. And also with Porsche engines, because you have this high dome, you can also prevent the flame front from traveling well. So the flame front starts at the spark plug, which comes out here, and so it starts on this side and moves over. And if your compression ratio is too high, the gap between the piston and the head is too small, and that flame front can't get over. So basically, there's a big balancing act going on here, and I want to get it right. And so what William recommended and spec'd out for me is that with this piston that he had machined by CP for me and a deck height of 1 millimeter, I should be able to get a compression ratio at about 9.74 to 1. And so that means the volume changes by 9.74 times, going from the full volume when the piston's down to the small volume when the piston's up. Now, to make sure that I'm actually going to get that here, we had to check what the volume of the head is. And so when you measure the volume of the head, you fill the combustion chamber of the head with the fluid and measure how much it is. And my machinist did that, and it turned out to be just about the same volume as what William said my head should be, about 89 milliliters, and my machinist measured 88.8. So, we're 0.2 milliliters off. I'd say that's close enough. So, long story long, I think I'm good with this thicker jug gasket of 1/2 millimeter instead of a 1/4 millimeter. So here's something a little funky that I noticed on piston number 4 when I measured the deck height. So if I measure it on this side, it comes out to be 0.91. When I measure it on this side, it comes out to be 1.22. So it's a little tipped. That could be just the piston cocked a little bit. It could also be the gasket, because the gasket seems to have a bit of a burr on it. And so what I'm going to do is put the head on and tighten it down, and to try to fully seat the gasket, and then rotate the engine a little bit, and then measure it again And hopefully I get more even measurements on each side. On the other side, on piston 1, I did. I had a very even measurement. It was about 1.05 on each side, millimeters. So let's do that and then check it again. All right, I just torqued down the head. I'm taking it off now. I put on lubricant on all the bolts, the correct ARP lubricant, just because I don't want to gall the threads, and I don't know. I think it's the right thing to do. It also enables you to torque an actual correct torque value down. So, yeah, a torque wrench, or the torque you apply to a fastener is greatly dependent on how lubricated the threads are, because the torque is determined by both the friction on the fastener and the axial preload you're applying to it in the thread pitch. So you want to use as much of that torque for axial preload as you can. So now I should be able to measure this, and hopefully we get a more uniform value. Head down there. All right, so side 1, what do we get? Push this down. And we get, I think I'm going to push it down a little more. .92 on that side, and we're going to get more still on this side. 1.19. So if we average those, we're still getting about the same as what we got on the other side. And Dempsey said also to average the value. So I think I'm okay with this. I think what's happening is the gasket is springing back a bit more this side. There's 1.15. I don't know how repeatable my process is in measuring this. 1.09 now. And as I hold this down, .23, rock the other way. No, 1.09. Yeah, so I think it's just, I've got some elastic spring back on the gasket. So if I push down, I can compress that some. So 1.08 and 1.09. Also known as good enough. I'm happy with that. I think it's a little more than the other side, but only by 0.04 thousandths or so, and there's a little compression. So I think that's good. I think this is going to be ready to go, and yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. I think now the cylinders are ready to assemble, so we can move on to the next step. The eagle-eyed viewer will notice that I am no longer in my workshop with the 964 behind me. I'm actually not in a workshop at all. I'm in the family room of my house, and it's a new house. It's actually been 18 months since I last worked on this project. I stopped filming these in the summer of 2020, and I think for many people, life has changed a bit since the summer of 2020. This is now December 2021. But my wife and I bought a new house, and we made a person. Here's the baby monitor of the baby sleeping upstairs right now. I do fortunately have a new workshop. I'm still setting it up, but it's a bigger space in the barn, which is across the driveway, which I'll show at some point. So all things are good on the car front, but I decided to put the engine together in the house because it's a cleaner and less dusty space. And also around the holidays, it's a nice place to hang out with the family while I'm putting together the engine. So where I left off was getting ready to put on the cylinder jugs and the pistons onto the short block. And one tip to those folks who I think in very real life situations might have large gaps of time between when they work on the project, stop, and restart work, is that if you use rubber bands to suspend the conrods so they don't clatter around and catch on the block when you turn the crankshaft, the rubber bands will rot out after a while. And I had the unpleasant surprise today when I unpackaged this. I had it covered with a plastic bag to keep dust off it. I had the unpleasant surprise that all the rubber bands had rotted and shrunk and broken and had actually stuck to the inside bores of the small ends of the conrods. So I had to clean those out with brake cleaner and alcohol, and I didn't use any abrasive because you don't want to. That is a high tolerance surface where there's an oil film. But I was able to get those out. So just note, if you use rubber bands, use them temporarily. I've actually put on the 1, 2, 3 cylinders already. They're on the underside of the engine right now, and I have 4, 5, 6 ready to go. And I'm going to walk through that process. I am using Dempsey's book for this, of course. I would follow his advice for the order of cylinders 1, 2, and 3 on the other side. Otherwise, you have an issue getting access to the wrist pin and putting in the retaining clip on one side if you don't do it in order. So follow that process. I think for cylinders 4, 5, and 6, it actually doesn't really matter. And I'm going to do it in the same direction as I did the other side, where I start at the end of the block, where this is, I think, technically cylinder 4. And Dempsey says to do this one last, but I think it's easier. It's going to be easier to go in with the clip on this end and then work my way in my frame of reference to the left. But there isn't really any height difference between this edge and this edge to put in the wrist pin, so I don't think it really matters on this side. But I'm just going to do it the way I did before. So with that, let's check out how to get the cylinders and pistons ready. Let's walk through the process of getting one of the pistons and cylinders ready. This is piston and cylinder 6. Even though I'm going to install 4 first, it doesn't matter. All the process is the same. First word of warning or advice I'd give is label what side you want to put your retaining ring in the piston on, because I messed this up the first time. That you're thinking about putting the cylinder on like this, but then you have to flip it around to put the ring in, and I ended up switching sides. So I've labeled this side for the ring first, given how I'm going to assemble it on the block. The next thing I learned the hard way is that if you push too hard and too quickly on the piston to raise out the bottom end, it's really easy to pop the piston out or pop some of the rings out. So you don't want to do that because you can damage the rings. And what I did on my engine is when I push the piston out, I just keep my hand over the end just to give some feedback and add kind of a last chance stop if it feels like it's going too far. And I also found that I had to rock it a little bit sometimes. That particularly as the piston comes out, there's less and less length of the piston in the bore, and so it's easier for it to rock, and it actually can go to a bigger angle, and thus it's easier to jam. So you just kind of have to work it a little bit gently and carefully until the wrist pin holes for the piston come up above the skirt on the cylinder. So yeah, just about there. All right. So then the next piece of advice I'd give is getting one of these things. It's called a Circlip Injector, and it's made by Stomski Racing. I didn't get this for free, I bought it. But what it is a sleeve where you put your circlip in a plunger, and it enables you to pop the circlip in really, really easily and conveniently. I find it to be much, much easier than the process that's explained in Dempsey's book, which requires like pliers and a screwdriver, particularly when you're working on putting the circlip in when the cylinder's in the block. There's just not much room. This thing pops right in, and it's super easy. The way it works is you take a circlip
And Stomski's website has a nice YouTube video that tells you how to use this. They recommend pushing the circlip in with a slotted screwdriver. I found that if I just squeeze the legs and push down with my other finger, I can push it in pretty easily. It takes some force, but you want to just push it in enough so it doesn't pop out, and there's still a lot sticking out. And then you want to tip it. Whoop, that popped out, so it needs to go in a little bit more. I also recommend wearing safety glasses around these things because there's a lot of energy. These are really stiff. Okay, so it's pushed in, and then you want to tip it so it's angled. And then what you do is you put the part of the circlip sticking out into the slot for the wrist pin bore on the piston, and the cylinder is going to be slightly tipped. They talk about this on Stomski's YouTube channel about this. But you need to tip it a little bit. But what's important is that the retaining ring, the circlip, is in the groove that it's going to pop into. And then once it's positioned like this, all you do is push it out with a plunger. And I found it's easier actually with two hands. You push it out, and it pops right into place. Yeah, so there we go. Quite easy, and also quite easy in the block. Then the other thing I did on my assembly is, before I put the wrist pin in, you want to use assembly lube, certainly on the bores of the small end of the connecting rods, but I also put a little bit in to the bore of the wrist pin hole in the piston. You know, when in doubt, lubricate it. I personally don't think you should leave that dry because you will there is a clearance there with the pin. And then the other thing is you want to clean all your mating surfaces before you put the cylinder in the block. So that's cleaning the copper gasket that acts as the seal between the cylinder and block, and the mating surfaces there. Also, I found on my copper gaskets there's a burr on one side and then a smooth side on the other where you've got a little chamfer or fillet on the edge. I put the gasket in such that I put the burr against the block, and I felt that actually fits quite well. So that's just my advice. I don't think it really matters. You're going to crush that burr probably anyway, but I found it seated well. Time to install cylinder and piston 5. I did just install cylinder and piston 4 and filmed it, but forgot to turn on my mic. So let's do it all again with 5. But it's the same process, so it doesn't really matter. I've turned the crank, so cylinder 5 is in top dead center. I've lubricated the opening of the small end of the conrod, the bearing. I need to clean, I did forget to clean all the mating surfaces, so I'm going to clean this surface where the copper gasket is going to mate, but I have cleaned the other surfaces as well as the gasket, so those are all ready. Also want to point out that I've put saran wrap over cylinder 6, and I learned this the hard way. I dropped a retaining ring as I was trying to lock in cylinder 4. I dropped a retaining ring into the block. Luckily, when I flipped the block over, it fell out, but that could be a real nightmare trying to fish one of those out with a magnet, particularly if it gets caught in a small place. So yeah, this is ready to assemble now. So first, I'm going to put on the copper gasket and put the burr side down. And I want to note as well that I'm going in a different order than what Dempsey says in his book. I do recommend going in the order he says, in order, the firing order, 1, 2, 3, on the other side of the block. But on this side, I don't think it totally matters, and because the height of these two surfaces are the same. But on this side, you have the chain, the timing chain in the way. So I think on both sides of the block, it made sense to first put a retaining ring in the cylinder on the back side of the engine, and then push the wrist pin in, and then put the final retaining ring in from the flywheel side of the engine. That's how I've done it. It seems to work so far. So okay, we've got the copper gasket in. That's aligned. There's no handedness of this. It can go in either way, 180 degrees either way. So now, put the piston in. Make sure it's oriented the right way. And the conrod's sticking up, so it's not going to bash it. The wrist pin is sticking out enough to give clearance to the conrod. And one difference that I've done versus what Dempsey talks about in his book is I haven't found it necessary to tap in the wrist pin. I found it that I can kind of feel as I push the wrist pin in where I start engaging the conrod and the holes line up and the pin in the hole lines up. And then just by wiggling things around, you can even turn the piston a little bit with the wrist pin. You can get it lined up, and I found it, I can push it in by hand, which I'm doing right now. And I'd recommend doing that because there's such precise surfaces around the wrist pin and the bore it's in, because that is a fluid bearing surface, that I would avoid tapping it if you can. And then the last part is snapping in the retaining ring. So again, Stomski's insertion tool works great, and it's pretty easy to access. I might have to stand up for this, but let's see if I can do it sitting down. So you get it in the groove, and it's a little tipped, and then you push, and I missed. So I'll try that again. But luckily I didn't drop it into the engine. So tip it, put it in, and this just shows how nice this tool is. I was able to reload that ring really quickly. Stand up to get more leverage. There we go. Perfect. And yeah, retaining ring is locked in perfectly. Awesome. All right, so now push the piston down. And you don't want to force it. You want to just do it gently so it's not scratching the bore or anything. Yep, so now it's flat. And the last thing I've been doing on each cylinder is just double checking the deck height one last time. So I bought these retaining nuts from Stomski. You can use just a regular head stud nut in a stack of washers or bolts or something, or a piece of pipe. But I like these because they have a plastic surface on the bottom that won't mar up the contact surface with the head where the O-ring sits. So you screw these down, and I've been using 2. I don't know what I'm going to do for cylinder 6 because I won't have 2 anymore. But for these, for the other ones, I have 2. And I'm just screwing them down on both sides just to have a more even clamping force. And then measuring the deck height one more time with my vernier calipers. So, yeah, that's not a correct measurement. I've had to do this a few times typically to get the bottom of these dead flat. Yeah, this is reading 1.36. I've been getting around 1.2 to 1.3, and that's right in spec. In Dempsey's book, he recommends a deck height between 1.25 and 1.5, and yeah, so getting 1.2 or 1.3 is right on. When I did my initial deck height measurement earlier in this video series, I got around 1 millimeter, and I think the difference is because I actually put the head on and cranked it down, which will slightly crush the copper gasket, but more so probably crush the burr on the copper gasket, and I think that's probably why I'm seeing a slight difference. But either way, you know, a little bit higher deck height isn't going to hurt you. It's just you get less compression ratio. Yeah, this is 1.28. That was a correct measurement. So these are all about the same. I like these CP pistons because they have that shoulder that enable you to do this. Yeah. So yeah, this is about 1.28. Yep, and then the process for cylinder 6 and piston 6 is the same thing as what I just showed. So yeah, this is one of the easier and fun parts, and it's looking more and more like an engine. The thing that actually does the work is in. I guess one more point that I'll know, and I highly recommend using Dempsey's book to do all this, is just wiping out the oil after. And I put saran wrap over the cylinders after I did that, wiped out all the excess oil, just so dust doesn't get on them. And you do that just, I guess it helps with break-in, so there's less oil to burn off. And it probably won't create particulates as much that could scratch the lining. So that's it.